taking some time with us this morning. My name is Micaiah. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders here at Fathom. And what we provide is the highest quality analytics for researchers of open ends and other kinds of text. The first thing that we're going to talk through is 3 optimizations in terms of the survey design itself. That is the structure of the questions and how you are building the survey itself. Then we're going to drill down with a little more focus into specific open ends themselves. And then we're going to look at 3 different templates that really put together both survey structure as well as open-ended wording into really batteries or structures that you can repurpose for your needs for many of the top use cases that we find. One sidebar that's going to run through this is I frequently get this question that is, what is the benefit of Fathom versus a generic large language model? One of the ways to illustrate that is I use ChatGPT to generate an image for us that was show me a cartoon of researchers creating a survey together, designing a survey together. And as you all know, and as I'm sure you've all experienced, you get something like this. And at first glance, it looks okay. And then when you look closer, you realize that there's all sorts of crazy things, not only misspellings and some sort of diabolical person over here without pupils and full coffee cups on the ground. In other words, it gives you something that at first glance looks okay, but it then becomes incredibly difficult to get it to the level of rigor that you need. And so this is one of the key things to keep in mind when you're thinking about text analysis is this kind of good enough result okay for you, or do you need precision, accuracy, and customization? And if you do need something better than this type of result with, let me just say, a wildly different number of fingers per human, then you're going to need a specialized tool like Fathom. So let's dive in, and I'm going to show you a few more of these as we weave through this. Start with branching off multiple choice for best results. So this is fairly straightforward, but I would say if you were going to do one single thing for your survey design in order to create richer responses, as well as be able to analyze them with a lot more value and actionability, this is the one thing that I would take away and would fight tooth and nail to be able to implement in my surveys. So what I mean by this is many times in a survey context, we are pairing closed-ended questions with open ends. A classic case is something like a net promoter score. Would you recommend, or how likely are you to recommend our service? And then following that, some type of why question. Very frequently, there's no branching involved. No matter what score you give, you then ask a why question. That causes a bunch of problems. If instead you create branching where depending on what someone says, do I like this product or not like this product? Do I support this candidate or not support this candidate? Whatever positional type of closed-ended question, you then branch unique and customized open ends. This allows you to be much more focused in what your open end is, really drilling into specific actionable areas of information that you want. It also creates a much better respondent experience, and it lets you analyze the data in a much more precise way. So I'm going to give examples for each of these as we go, because in some ways the example becomes even clearer than the principles that we'll start with. So over here on the left, this is what I was just describing. This is a classic NPS question. We have, scale of 1 to 10. How likely are you to recommend us? And then very frequently, we receive data sets where no matter what score was given, the same question is asked for everybody. Why did you give that score? This creates a number of problems. For the respondent, they are asked something that's actually pretty vague and pretty difficult, and they're likely to give a very high-level answer to. It also means that you have to create a single code frame that's going to be all-encompassing of all of the good things and all of the bad things, and it's going to have to fit all together. And as a result, it's going to be very high level. It's not going to be very actionable. In contrast, if we branch it instead and we say, okay, same leading question, but now we're going to split it at least into detractors and promoters. And we're going to ask a different question of each. And that different question is going to have the opportunity to really focus the respondent on something that is what I call an actionable lever of feedback. It's actually not just why, it's usually a what question. In this case, what's one change we could make that would make it more likely that you recommend Fathom? So this is both easier for a respondent to answer. It's also far more actionable, and you're going to be able to create a much more focused and detailed code frame that essentially is a list of changes that you could make, rank ordered by frequency, in order to retain more customers. For promoters, you might ask something else. In this case, what's something we should keep the same? Again, you're going to be able to customize and create a much more detailed code frame here. And together, you're effectively going to be getting a list of things we should change and things we should keep the same, which is a much more structured and rigorous and helpful and actionable list of themes and codes for you and for your friends in product development and other parts of the company, as compared to the sort of vague, high-level, unactionable results that you typically get without branching. So number one, branch off your closed ends wherever possible. Create these kinds of much more focused questions. Which leads us into our second principle, which is using priming effects to your advantage. Now, this one's a little subtle. I will invite you at the question period if you would like to ask some questions about this one. I'm going to move through it somewhat quickly, but ask questions at the end. We can talk more about it. The idea is that open ends are particularly high value to use earlier on in your survey when you haven't primed the respondent as much, because you have the benefits of truly unaided awareness capture. And so as a consequence, you can be thoughtful about walking your respondents through a particular thought process, and typically one that starts more open-ended and gets more specific with each question as you drill down, as opposed to the opposite. If you start specific and then ask really open-ended questions, that specific question you just started with is going to cause priming effects that mess up your open end. But in contrast, if you start with the broadest, most open-ended question and then get incrementally more specific, you can get some really interesting results. So this one is especially helpful to look at as an example. If we look on the left here, this is kind of a classic brand awareness question. So we saw something very similar to this, a different brand. So we've anonymized it, but the structure was like this. How likely are you to consider a given product when shopping for a certain category? And then following that, what other brands do you consider? There are obvious priming effect issues here where this question is going to be influenced by having mentioned Dawn specifically, and you're not at all capturing the unaided awareness with which this particular product comes to mind for this person. And you're really just not getting as much data as you could. On the other hand, if you create something that starts at the highest level, so something that we used very frequently at Avalanche was actually this two pair of open ends. So in this case, it's name all of the brands that come to mind when you think of cleaning products. And we specifically encourage you to think broadly, name basically as many as you can. And then following that, which is the single one that you're most likely to purchase. This sort of very broad and then pick the single one sequence can be very powerful and is very multi-purpose to different areas. We did a lot of work in the civic space. We would ask, what are all the issues that are most important to the economic security of your family? Okay, now tell me what's the single most important one. That is not only beneficial from a priming effect standpoint, but it also actually helps you get the richest possible answers for this one, because you effectively ask the respondent to think through the full universe of options in a structured way and then pick the single best one. You're going to get a lot better response for this question in particular. So even if all you cared about was the second question, throw one of these in first, because it's going to get the respondents to think through the universe and then select one, and you're going to get something much more precise. And then following that, of course, we still need our specific question about our brand within our category. And of course, you can then segment these open ends as a function of these ones down here and look at the unaided awareness for those who would consider or not consider the particular product that we're looking at. So for this one in particular, thinking about this funnel of really open-ended, name all the things, okay, now tell me the one particular, but keeping them both open-ended, and then following that, finally, the closed-ended variable that you really need for your tracking purposes as well. Third principle we're going to look at here in survey structuring: if probing, stay focused. By probing, I particularly mean dynamic AI tools for probing for more information when a respondent initially answered a survey open-end. So there's a number of products out there. Some of them are built into survey platforms, some of them stand alone. And the whole idea here is that you've asked an open-ended question, a respondent has given an initial answer, and the system creates a specific probe based on what the respondent said to elicit more detail. This can be a really great way to get more rich responses if used in a focused and judicious way. So there's a few things, and we process a ton of this data. So we really do get to see data sets where this is used well and data sets where it's not used so well. So a few things to keep in mind as you're thinking about leveraging these tools. One is simple probes are the way to go. You effectively want a probe that says, tell me a little bit more, and maybe with a little more customization, but you really just want more detail on the thing the respondent was already saying. That's going to give you the best results, and I'll show you an example for why. You also want to be careful to use it in a space where a respondent is likely to only mention one main thing about which you could ask for more detail. If a respondent mentions, if it's say, name all the brands that you think of when you think of cleaning products, and they mention 12, and then the AI prompt follows up and asks about some random selection of one of those, that's obviously going to bias and fragment your data set in ways that are problematic. So you want to use this in a place where a respondent is going to give you an initial, fairly focused answer. You can ask for a little more detail. Consistent with that is the idea that you only want to probe once. Early on in the use of these tools, there were a lot of tools that would say it's just going to chat basically with the respondent for multiple rounds. The challenge with that is after the first probe, you typically get wildly off topic in a different direction that's unhelpful. So just a single round of probing is the way to go. And then finally, from a data analysis standpoint, if you've done it in a focused way, you effectively have question, response, probe, response. The best thing to do is to take those two responses, pipe them together into a single piece of text, and analyze that all together as if it were basically one rich open end. So let me give you an example. This one gets a little complicated because of the probing, so we're going to touch lightly on it, and again, ask some questions if you'd like at the end. So over on the left, we have an anonymized example of something we saw recently, which was, okay, what cereals do you eat most often, effectively was the question. Respondents were then mentioning a series of different things. The probe was then following up about one of them. So again, here it's just picking one of these and asking for more about that. On a different respondent, it might have picked a different one. The respondent then answers, and then the second probe takes them wildly off topic here, right? So by the time we're down here, this is the type of probing that is just not helpful, to say nothing of a really negative user experience. On the other hand, if we were working in the same type of survey and we took a more structured and focused approach, one might be to actually use some closed ends because we want to use probing to get a little more focus on where we're going to do our open-ended exploration. So in this case, we say, okay, which of these cereals do you enjoy? And then we're going to branch and we're going to do some diving in. So in this case, again, open-end, what do you enjoy about that particular cereal? A response, and then just a simple one-time probe. Can you tell me more about that? And then they give a little bit more information. And so in the analysis, then you would actually pipe together this. So the full response that you would be theming or tagging, or that Fathom would analyze, would say, the way it makes me feel healthy and full of energy. And so that would code for how it makes me feel, health and energy, right? And that together is really nice. And this probe was helpful because it got us health and energy as more detail behind this. So this is an example of just a nice, simple version of probing. That's how you want to do it. And you really want to avoid complex, fragmented, multi-round probing that can really create a very fragmented and difficult to analyze data set over there. So I know that I've been moving a bit quickly, so I just want to recap the 3 rules that we have for better survey design, and then we're going to go into better question writing. So the first, and again, if I was going to take away one thing from this and implement, it would be branching off my multiple choice in order to create specific focused open ends for those different branches, and then analyzing and creating unique code frames for those is just going to radically increase the actionability of your open-ended insights. The second one is using these priming effects and thinking about how am I going to walk a respondent through a thought process that starts as wide open as possible and then gets more focused as I go, that avoids some of the challenges of priming with something too specific, but it also can help the respondent explore a universe of what their question and topic is really all about. And then from having sort of refresh their mind with those things, be able to then provide more focused answers as they go. And then finally, with dynamic probing, we love this kind of data. And we also really encourage you to use it in a focused way, a single probe, and really one that just says, tell me more about that thing you just said, gets a little more richness, combine those responses into a single cell, and analyze that as effectively a single rich open end is by far the best way to go. So as we move over to 3 rules for better open ends specifically, I'm going to return to my ChatGPT story here. So in this case, this is about 4 prompts later from the original image that I showed you, where I had worked with it to try to wrangle it to give me the right number of fingers, to try to spell things correctly. We've still got some issues going on there. We have a peculiar volume of what I suppose are ink bottles here. And it looks like maybe it's heading in the right direction. But obviously, we have a whole other kind of issue showing up, which is we've got four sort of Don Draper-esque characters here with some sort of American flag type motif going on with their ties. And of course, the only female researcher in the frame, literally in the background with a notepad. So this is a great example of the type of bias that you can also see a generic LLM tool injecting into your analysis. And again, is another one of the reasons that you really need human supervision of these kinds of tools to correct for the kinds of results that at first glance you can say, okay, that's pretty good, but in fact have very, very problematic biases and other errors riddled throughout them. So again, focused, dedicated AI tools for open-ends are very worth it. And this is one of the reasons why at Fathom, it's all built around human supervision of these tools in order to get the highest quality analysis as well, and to keep an eye on these LLMs that can go awry if you don't keep a close eye. So let's go for better open-end question writing specifically. So in this one, we're going to go through 3 rules for these. And again, we're going to start with what, if I was going to pick one other thing, would be the first thing that I would encourage, which is to be focused and specific in your open ends. Now, this might seem a little counterintuitive because I think often people think of open ends as the opportunity to be expansive. However, if you are vague in your open ends, you will get vague, unhelpful responses. And so the best kinds of open ends are actually focused on, again, what I think of as actionable points of feedback. So still open-ended, but you're asking about something specific to which the types of responses are going to be the kinds of things you would act on. And so really thinking that through is really important. So just at the basic level, make sure that your open ends are not sort of an excuse to be vague. I often see survey drafts where it's a whole bunch of closed-ended questions. And then at the end, there's kind of this throwaway open end, tell us anything else that comes to mind or something like that. And it's this kind of vague catch-all. And typically when we're at the survey writing stage and we just want to be done and we just want to field it, we're like, well, we'll just see what comes up. I have never seen a single survey where that kind of open end yielded something really, really helpful. Similar to that, you would be surprised how much ambiguity there can be in open-ended question wording. So really encourage even just small sample pre-testing. I could tell you lots of stories from Fathom. We would frequently, or sorry, at Avalanche, our previous company, we would frequently test a given survey, and we would do, a dozen different question wordings for some of the key questions. And very frequently we'd be surprised by what we thought was a straightforward question would be interpreted different ways. So a little bit of pre-testing can go a long way. Even just a dozen respondents per question can be really helpful. Next, be very careful of double barrels. We just processed a whole bunch of these this week. And frequently this looks something like, do you like this product or not, and why? That, of course, is bad for the respondent, but it creates a really messy data set where some people say, yes, I like it, no, I don't like it. Some people give a why response, some people only give one of them, and you really don't get a clear read on it. So if nothing else, make sure that you're just asking a single question in your open end. And then, as I was saying, focusing on those actionable points of feedback is going to give you much more actionable responses. So let's look at a few examples. One way that I think about this is to think about effectively a spectrum of open-endedness. So some open-ended questions are so narrow that they might as well be a multiple choice. Do you like cats? There's basically 2 answers to that. And so you might as well be asking a multiple choice question. On the other hand, there are some open-ended questions that are so wide open and so open to interpretation that they're going to have all the problems I just talked about. And so what you really want to think about is this middle space of the spectrum, what our team has come to think of as focused open questions. This gives the respondent a much better experience of what are the particular point of feedback are you interested in, but still gives them the flexibility to name anything, describe their experience completely open-ended, but focused on what is the actual point of feedback for you. So keep in mind this sort of spectrum, and when you're looking at your open ends, think about how you can tighten them up to be focused while still allowing the respondent the space to name any range of things that might come up in relation to that issue. So here's a few examples that I think hopefully illustrate it for you. On the left, we have, is there anything else you'd like to share? A classic end, particularly of employee engagement surveys. Anything else you'd like to share? Could be good, could be bad. Again, I've never seen anything helpful come out of this question. A much more helpful version would be, is there anything else we could do to improve your experience? This is much more focused on what are the things we could fix. It's based on, an underlying theory that is the point of this question is to find problems to solve. So let's ask about what are the problems we could solve. If you had a different question or a different point you wanted, then focus on that instead. Next, we've got, a classic question in the civic space, which is we ask, do you care or not care about some kind of issue in the world? And then why is that issue important? Again, this broad why opens up a ton of different spaces of interpretation. A much more actionable version is, in what specific way does that issue impact you or your community? And again, this rests on a theory that is one of the reasons people care about things is because they're impacted by them. If we understand how they're impacted by them, then we can communicate to people about those impacts in a way that resonates. So this much more specific thing is going to give us a list of ways that people are impacted, much more actionable than over here. We're going to get a much more abstract sort of intellectual theory of why and policy and much less actionable things. Down here, I've just made this even more generic. So any question that starts with, why do you? I immediately start thinking about how do I shift that into, again, something that focuses on a much more actionable point of feedback. So what is the most important reason? What is the most important part? What is the most important quality? Which one of these I'm choosing is really going to depend on my theory of the underlying research, my theory of impact, and what is the point of leverage that my insights could have on the decision makers. If we're looking at something like a piece of content, I want to know what's the most important part, because in content creation, we can change different parts, right? So thinking about the theory of how the data is going to be used and what is the point of most actionability lets you do this kind of honing. This leads us very naturally into the second rule that we have for open-ended feedback, which is replacing why with what. So I just did this in a couple examples. This is a more universal way of thinking about it. And again, I think this is one of the simple things to just keep in your pocket when you're looking at your survey design and just going through and saying, okay, any question that starts with why, could I instead frame that as a what question? And here's what I mean by that. Why often fails for a few reasons. First of all, on its own, it's quite vague. So if I was to, again, if I was doing civic research and I said, do you support this candidate or not? And, some people said yes and some people said no. And then I said, why do you support or not support them? That is going to be a very difficult to unpack question for a lot of people, and they're going to interpret it different ways. Some of them will talk about their lived experience, some will talk about the candidate, some will talk about the state of the country, some will talk about their friends and family. And so it's very vague and open to lots of different ways of interpretation. It also frequently does not actually focus on the actionable levers. And most complex, but also most problematic, it requires a respondent to have kind of their own model of why they do things. And this just actually isn't the case. If I was going to ask a consumer, why do you buy this brand? Their answer for understanding their own behavior is actually not especially precise. They might talk about product features. They may talk about trusting their friend who recommended it. They may talk about a bunch of other things, but it's actually very rarely actually a true description of why they are behaving in a certain way. And so a much better thing to do is to think of what is our causal model for why people do things, and how can I change my question into a what to focus on those factors. So here's some ways to think about that. I'm going to skip right to the examples here. So if we look at on the brand side, why do you like that brand? I would switch that to something like, what specifically do you like most about products made by that brand, right? So this is getting us into a list of product features. And again, we're using our own sort of causal model here of the reason people like brands is because they like features about those brands. So let's ask about those features. That may or may not be the only way of thinking about it, but it does give us something much more specific and much more actionable that we can work with. And you could have different versions of this that you could ask based on different theories of the case. Again, we have one here, why are you unlikely to recommend us? Instead, I would ask something like, what happened that makes you unlikely to recommend us? This rests on the theory that someone who's not going to recommend you probably had a bad experience. If we can understand what those bad experiences are, we can prevent them in the future and make people more likely to recommend us. So let's just ask about what those bad experiences were. Over here, why do you approve, of a given candidate? Again, a much better question. What specific quality do you like the most? This gives us a list of qualities. That's going to be much more actionable for a host of decisions that can be made. Why is this important? Why is this issue important to you? Similarly, what specific way does that issue impact your life is a much more actionable and clear way to frame that kind of a question. So I'm going to skip just back to this just to hit these principles again, which is replacing why with what is going to get you much more actionable insights, in particular because it's going to force you to narrow down your theory of the case of what's the most actionable feedback that I need. It's going to then also yield more richer, more coherent data set, and it also just creates a much better respondent experience overall. Third, one of my personal favorites. A lot of times as survey writers and authors, we can get a little sterile in our wording. And one of the questions we used to get very frequently at Avalanche when we did large-scale surveys with a lot of open ends is, oh my gosh, isn't your completion rate terrible? And what we found, and we tested this a ton, is if we wrote our open ends very poorly in a way that they were confusing and onerous, and it wasn't clear that we actually cared what the person said, then yes, it did impact our completion rates. But if we wrote them in a way that was human and empathetic and actually explained that and sort of indicated we do actually really care what you say here, then it actually increased our completion rates. It actually became one of the best filters for data quality for us. So when you are writing your open ends, I would really encourage you to sound a little more human, find ways to show that you value the opinion. Often this is explaining indirectly or directly why you're asking the question, and that this kind of approach can elicit really, really helpful feedback and also increase your respondent experience and increase your completion rates as well. So a couple examples here. Interestingly, I'll note that these things on the right are actually what AI probes are actually frequently doing more. And we sort of exist in a funny world where the AI is often sounding more human than the human written survey questions. I think that's nonsense. And I think we as human researchers should also be able to write more human and empathetic questions that are clear and precise and focused, but also connect with our respondents in a more empathetic way. So on the left, we have why is, in this case, healthcare an important issue. This has all of the why problems, but it's also just very difficult for a person to answer. Like, where would I even begin in explaining to you why an issue like this is important to me? A much better question might be something like, and this is actually one of the wordings we tested dozens and dozens of times at Avalanche, and we found this, which might sound weird, works really well. Tell me something about you and your experience with insert issue, in this case, healthcare, to help me understand why you feel that way. So this very consistently yields personal narratives, personal experiences. And because we're indicating that we actually give a crap about this person's experience and that we want to understand why they feel a certain way, this drives really high completion rates. Similarly, why would you not recommend our product? Sterile, not very helpful. I'm already telling you I don't want to recommend this product. Why should I go to the effort of giving you more information? A much better question, we're so sorry that you had a bad experience and we want to be able to do better in the future. What specific experience did you have that made you feel this way? Again, this has improved in terms of its specificity, but it's couched within language that actually connects, and again, is going to drive much better respondent experience and much richer insights as a consequence. So again, recapping, 3 rules for better open ends. Again, most important, being specific and focused, thinking about that spectrum that I showed from very, very narrow to way too open, find that middle space in between. A great way to do that, if you're having trouble, is turn the why into what, and use that as a way to force you to get more specific about what's the actionable point of feedback here that I really want input on, and then focus in on that. And then finally, when you're actually writing it, sound like a human, show a little bit of empathy, directly or indirectly indicate why this is important. You're going to get higher completion rates, better respondent experience, and richer results at the end of the day. Okay, we're now going to go ahead and put it all together into some templates, if you will, for some of the top use cases. We're going to combine some of the principles for how to structure your survey, along with some of the principles for writing better individual questions specifically. These are intended to be both specific templates you could use for these use cases, but they're also very multi-purpose. Again, in our time at Avalanche, we had a few dozen of these. We just called them batteries. They were sequences of open-ended and closed-ended questions that we could sort of drag and drop into different applications very, very easily by just changing the topic, changing the specifics of the question. So I'm going to go through them as specific use cases, but they are also very multi-purpose as well. The first category that I'm going to look at, and we see a ton of data around these kinds of questions, are unaided awareness and association questions. So we see this, particularly in the brand space, but we also see it in other areas. Message creation and testing, leadership perception. So have you heard about this person? What have you heard? What emotion comes to mind when you think of them? Similarly around issues. Really, if you want to understand in an unaided way, what are the immediate associations that a group of respondents have to a topic, a brand, a message, a leader? This is a really, really great application. So I'm going to use a brand tracking example just to walk through a nice structure for how you might do this. And again, this could be used for any of the use cases that I just talked about. So per the image that I showed, we're going to use Tesla as an example here. So again, from the priming principle that we were talking about, I'm going to start very open-ended. I'm going to say what word or phrase first comes to mind when you think of Tesla. All right, so very open-ended. We haven't primed them at all. We just want immediate unaided association. Next, we're going to focus a little bit more. We did a lot of work around understanding the emotional drivers of behavior, again, at least as important as sort of the intellectual, rational drivers of people. And one of the best ways to understand emotional association is literally to ask people to name the emotion they feel when they think about a given topic. So what emotion best describes how you feel when you think about Tesla? This is going to give us a nice list of emotions with a lot of nuance and detail that we can slice and dice lots of different ways. Now getting more specific, have you heard anything about Tesla in the news or media in the last week? This is going to be a closed-ended question, yes or no. If yes, what specifically have you heard? And then finally, at the end, do you have a positive or negative view of Tesla? In this case, I'm saying a 5-point Likert scale, but you could use whatever scale you want. So you can see how this is drilling down and that it's structured based on the priming. You can see how we're using much more specific what-based questions here with the ability to also cut this data different ways. So one of the things we most often would do is we would say, okay, let's look at the unaided association and the emotional associations as a function of positive or negative views of Tesla. That then helps us really understand what are the associations as well as the feelings that are driving positive or negative views of the brand. Because we have structured it this way, we are going to get really good results. You can imagine if we had started with this question, it's going to bias and throw off everything else here. So this structure is really nice. You can use this again in lots of different applications. Next one, this is a really big category. This is probably like most of survey research that we look at, which is looking at the behavioral and attitudinal drivers of purchasing behavior, attitudinal stances on things, any other number of behavioral measures. So why are people doing things, basically? We see this, of course, in NPS. Would someone recommend or not our service? And we want to know why. What are the drivers of high NPS? What are the drivers of low NPS? Usage, high usage, low usage, cancellation, of course. Content testing, people liking or not liking content. And of course, in the civic space, we see a ton of this as well. So I'm just going to use an NPS example because we've been looking at that. But again, this could start with pretty much any type of positional question. Do you approve, disapprove, like, dislike, any kind of scale question? We're then going to start, in this case, for Fathom's NPS. We're going to say, okay, 0 to 10, how likely are you to recommend Fathom? And in this case, I'm going to branch it 3 different ways. For those who are our promoters, we're going to say, we're thrilled to recommend Fathom. And in this case, we're going to ask what's the most important thing for us to keep the same so that you want to keep recommending Fathom, right? So nice human wording here, and then focus down here, we're getting a list of things to keep the same. For those who are in the middle, again, some human language to get us going and show that we actually care. And then in this case, we're focused down on what can we improve to make you more confident. So again, this is going to get a list of improvements. This next one for our detractors has a different preamble. This is really geared towards eliciting helpful responses to the following question, which is what can we specifically change to improve your experience? So you'll notice that the what question for both our detractors and our neutrals are somewhat similar, but the framing is really different. And importantly, we're going to code each of these independently. So we're going to get a code frame for those who love us and what are the things we should keep the same. Those who are neutrals, they're going to be mentioning different types of topics. We want a detailed code frame for them. And then finally, we're going to look at our detractors and what's really going on for them as well, with a detailed code frame to really be able to understand and unpack that. So again, this is just a straightforward example of really good branching, human language, and transitioning those why questions into focused what questions that focus on the particular levers of feedback of what, in this case, we're going to keep the same or what we're going to change, that let us create really custom and actionable code frames that are going to yield really powerful insights for us. Finally, the other use case that we see a lot of is around navigating uncertain times. We certainly have plenty of that in the world around us. And during our time at Avalanche, we did a ton of work around the emergence of COVID. And early on, there was a period where no one had any idea what was going on. And so open-ended questions were an especially powerful way to understand how people were experiencing this particularly unprecedented event. So we see this kind of thing particularly around unprecedented events, but we also see this kind of use case often in ongoing tracking, where we're sort of monitoring a baseline and we're looking for spikes and changes. And we want to be able to understand rapidly shifting issues. And of course, we see it around PR and crisis communications. Something goes wrong, a company or a leader needs to understand how they're going to respond in that type of moment based on where their people are at. So I'm going to take an example. This is actually from some research that Avalanche did in the very early days of COVID. This was, I think, a week or two after the WHO declared a pandemic. And so we start in this case, we really wanted to understand how people were experiencing the challenges of COVID. We all had our assumptions. Looking back, it seems obvious, but at the time, no one had any idea how people were experiencing this. So we started with a question, what's the greatest challenge that COVID creates for your family? And then this was for a public policy project. And so we then wanted to understand, who do you think is to blame for these challenges? So these two questions became really interesting pairings to be able to see where the locus of blame for different types of participants and respondents were. And then finally, following that, we're going to ask particularly about one particular kind of actor, the government. This is a closed-ended question. And then this is going to branch into what do you think is wrong and what do you think is right, right? So specific, customized what questions here. So lots going on here in terms of using priming effects effectively in the right order, walking through a specific thought process, getting open-ended understanding of challenges, open-ended understanding of blame. This is a really interesting example of a question that focuses on something specific, which is that there was a concern around where people were going to effectively place blame, how that would affect things like vaccination rates and so on. And so this is much more actionable than something like a why question, but an interestingly unique example of it. And then, of course, good branching down here as well. So the final thing that I want to do as we shift towards the question period is show you, whether it's Fathom or any other tool, there's a set of things that you are going to need to be able to do once you have elicited really rich feedback from your respondents. Let's go ahead and take a look at an example here. Again, we're going to look at a survey that is about